Terence parked his dusty pickup truck in front of Elliot's Taproom, a modest tavern located just off Highway 74 in North Carolina, as the faint glow of neon signs flickered against the darkening sky. The pub was a basic establishment that served as a reliable destination for locals, truckers and those who were weary from the road, seeking a refreshing beverage and a tranquil area. Terence, who had recently returned from deployment a week ago, desired nothing more than a moment to unwind before returning to the responsibilities of daily life. Terence entered the room by opening the creaky door and was welcomed by the hum of an ancient jukebox that was playing Johnny Cash, as well as a wave of chatter. He examined the room, observing the typical crowd, a few loners sipping beer in solitude, a group of friends laughing at the bar and a couple of regulars playing pool. He did not arrive in order to establish friendships, rather, he intended to unwind. He discovered a corner table in the rear, which was concealed but still afforded him an unobstructed view of the room. The subdued ambience was complemented by his camouflage uniform, with the exception of the scuffed trainers on his feet, which were selected for their comfort rather than their aesthetic appeal. Terence ordered a glass of water and sipped it discreetly, his mind wandering to the family he would finally see after an extended period of time. All he could think about was his niece's enthusiastic voice and his mother's culinary creations. His reverie was abruptly interrupted when the door burst open. A group of 6 men entered the room, their heavy boots reverberating against the wooden floor. They were elderly, and their leather jackets were adorned with patches and insignias that indicated their status as veterans. They were boisterous, giggling and giving each other a pat on the back as they made their way to the bar. Terence glanced at them briefly before returning to his beverage. However, one of the males did not merely cast a glance back. Terence's appearance caused the leader, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard and penetrating eyes, to cease his laughter. He muttered something to his cohort, and they all turned to observe. The room gradually filled with a simmering tension as their laughter subsided. Terence perceived their gazes but refrained from responding. He had previously encountered that type of gaze, one that evaluated you without regard for context. He attempted to concentrate on the jukebox rather than the increasing unease that seemed to permeate the air as he sipped his water. The group gathered at the bar, their voices subdued but pointed. The burly leader whispered something, and one of the others laughed, casting a pointed look in Terence's direction. Terence maintained his composure, his posture was relaxed, and his sensibilities were acute. Many years of service had taught him the importance of maintaining his composure in high-pressure situations. Nevertheless, the significance of their gazes was not overlooked. Terence was about to experience an unexpected twist in the night, which had begun as a straightforward escape. The heavy thuds of boots drowned out the murmur of the jukebox as the group of men made their way towards Terence's table. The burly man with the salt and pepper beard, their commander, was at the forefront, his gaze fixed on Terence in the manner of a hawk assessing its prey. Terence perceived the energy shift prior to their arrival. The room, which was previously reverberating with informal conversation, became noticeably subdued. The barman paused in the middle of the serve, and the regulars regarded the group with caution. Terence leaned back slightly and set his glass down, his calm demeanor concealing the alertness that had settled into his musculature. "Hey," the leader yelled, halting a mere few feet from Terence. His voice was gruff, gravelly, and tinged with a hint of contempt. "Nice uniform you got there. Where'd you get it? A Halloween store?" The men seated behind him chuckled, their mirth reeking of mockery. Terence's expression was composed as he gazed upward. He had heard far worse, much worse. He responded in a uniform manner, "It is mine." "Earned it." The leader raised an eyebrow, attempting to portray astonishment. "Earned it, huh? That's funny, because I've seen plenty of real soldiers, and none of them wear trainers with their fatigues. You're trying to play dress up for sympathy or maybe a free drink?" Terence's mandible contracted slightly, but his tone remained unaffected. "I don't need sympathy or free drinks. I'm just here to enjoy my evening." As the leader approached, his lips curled into a smirk, and his beer-soaked exhalation infiltrated Terence's space. He scoffed, "You do not resemble a soldier to me. Where's your boots? Your tags? Hell, you probably don't even know how to salute properly." One of the men who was in front of him commented, "I bet he couldn't tell us the slightest thing about basic training." Another individual responded, "He has likely never visited a battlefield in his lifetime." The group once more burst into hilarity, their voices clashing with the low hum of the jukebox. Terence maintained his silence, his gaze intermittently shifting between the two males. He was not intimidated, but he was also not about to exacerbate the situation. He had acquired the ability to select his conflicts during his years in the military. But there was something about this encounter that rubbed him raw. There was more to it than their words, it was their ignorance and audacity. Terence eventually stated, "I do not need to demonstrate anything to you." His voice was composed yet authoritative. The leader, who was now visibly irritated by Terence's composure, took a further step forward, his substantial frame hovering over the table. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh? Walking in here like you belong? I don't think you do." The room appeared to be in a state of pause. Terence maintained his composure as he met the man's gaze. He stated, "I have completed 3 overseas tours, and I am not dependent on your approval to be a part of any organization." His voice was composed but possessed an edge. For a brief period, the merriment ceased. The leader's confidence was shaken by Terence's remarks, causing him to hesitate. However, his pride would not permit him to retreat. Rather, he sneered. "Yeah? Prove it. Show us your tags. Otherwise, you're nothing but a liar." Terence's gaze shifted to the other members of the group, where he observed their apprehensive expressions. But none of them ventured to speak up, as they were no longer as certain about their leader's accusations. He was able to resist the impulse to escalate by slowly exhaling. He stated, "I am not required to provide you with evidence. But if you think starting something here is a good idea, I'd suggest you think again." The tension in the room was tangible. Ready to summon assistance, the bartender's palm hovered near the telephone. The other patrons' gazes alternated between Terence and the group as they adjusted in their seats. Nevertheless, the commander refrained from acting. Rather, his grin returned, this time with a greater degree of sharpness and malice. His voice was low and menacing as he said, "You possess a sharp tongue. Let's see if it's as quick as your fists." The moment was suspended in the air, as if it were a wire poised to break. The leader's grin deepened as he advanced, his hand reaching for Terence's collar. His movement was clumsy, propelled more by bravado than talent, but it was sufficient to initiate the process. Terence did not contemplate, rather, he responded. He sidestepped the grasp with a swift, precise movement, catching the man's wrist in mid-air, as years of training kicked in. In a single, fluid motion, Terence contorted the arm behind the man's back and used his weight to propel him forward, thereby pinning him face first against the edge of the table. The leader's bravado evaporated in an instant, as he let out a strangled yelp of agony. The remaining motorcyclists were frozen in place, their wide-eyed gazes fixed on their immobilized leader, as the bar erupted in gasps and murmurs. No one moved for a brief period. Terence's voice penetrated the stunned stillness due to its unmistakable authority, despite its low and controlled tone. "I told you to think twice before starting something." His grasp was firm but not overly tight, and he slightly leaned in. "You don't know who you're messing with." Despite the leader's efforts to resist Terence's grip, it was ultimately unsuccessful. The soldier's calm efficacy prevented any possibility of error or escape. One of the bikers, who was standing across the room, took a hesitant step forward, raising his palms in a half-hearted attempt to intervene. "Hey, man," he stumbled. "Let him go. He didn't mean nothing by it." Terence's gaze fixed on the individual. "He approached me. You observed it." His voice was unwavering, untainted by the disorder that enveloped him. "If you want him free, tell him to calm down first." The barman, who had been silently observing with the phone in his hand, eventually spoke up. "Maybe it's time for you all to leave before this gets worse." However, the commander, who was affectionately referred to as Hank by one of his friends, was not prepared to concede. He snarled through gritted teeth, despite the fact that his arm was contorted and his face was pressed to the table. "Call the cops. This guy just assaulted me. He's wearing a fake uniform, and I want him arrested." Hank stumbled forward, clutching his arm as he turned to glare at the soldier, and Terence released him with a controlled thrust. He hissed, his tone dripping with malice, "You will be held accountable for this." Emboldened by the perceived slight against their commander, the remaining bikers rallied behind him. One of them reached for a telephone and dialed 911 with trembling hands. "Yes, we have a person here who is impersonating a soldier," he stated, his voice being audible to all in the tavern. "And he just assaulted my friend." Terence maintained a composed demeanor, despite the fact that his thoughts were exceedingly active. He was aware of the appearance of the situation and the potential for it to escalate out of control. However, he was also aware that he had not committed any wrongdoing. Everything he stood for, his years of service, his sacrifices, would withstand their frivolous accusations. He was merely required to maintain his composure. The bar was now alive with murmurs, as patrons whispered among themselves and cast sidelong glimpses at Terence. Some of them appeared uneasy, while others appeared discreetly impressed by the effortless manner in which he had managed the situation. However, no one rose to the occasion to contest the events that had transpired. The tension in the air was punctured by the sound of approaching sirens. Shifting shadows were cast across the room as red and blue lights flickered against the bar's windows. The police had arrived. The doors swung wide. 2 officers entered the establishment. One was a man with a close-cropped haircut and a broad shoulder, whose countenance was obscured by mirrored sunglasses. The other individual was a woman with a placid, observant demeanor and sharp features. The room was immediately subdued as all eyes were directed towards them. The male officer stated, "We received a call regarding an altercation." His voice was composed yet authoritative. "Can someone explain what's going on here?" Hank, who was still red-faced from the encounter, was the first to respond, clutching his wrist. He directed a trembling finger at Terence. "That guy assaulted me, and he's impersonating a soldier. Look at him, he doesn't even have proper boots on." Terence, who was standing calmly by his table, was the object of the officer's attention. His posture was relaxed but alert. The officer's tone was neutral as he inquired, "Is that accurate?" Terence steadily shook his head and gazed at the officer. "No, sir. This man and his friends confronted me because they didn't believe I'm a real soldier. When he tried to grab me, I defended myself." Her eyes scanned the room as the female officer stepped forward. She inquired, her voice emanating a sense of tranquility and authority, "Did anyone observe the events?" The barman broke the tense silence by speaking up. "I saw it. Hank went after him first. That soldier just reacted to protect himself, it wasn't an assault." The room was swept by a gentle murmur of consent. "Hank has been on edge since he entered the establishment," according to a patron who was situated near the phonograph. The officer, who was male, returned to Terence. "Do you have any proof of your service, sir?" Terence maintained a measured pace as he gestured towards the duffel bag on the floor by his table, nodding. "In that bag, I've got my service uniform with my name and rank. I also have my ID in my wallet. You are welcome to take a look." Upon retrieving the bag, the officer meticulously opened it, revealing a precisely folded uniform that was adorned with badges and insignias. He briefly examined it before turning to his companion, who nodded in quiet confirmation. The male officer responded with a firm yet deferential tone, "You are clear. We appreciate your cooperation." Hank, who was still nursing his bruised pride, snarled, "You are merely going to accept his word for it. He could have fabricated all of that." Hank received a pointed glance from the female officer. "Enough. From what I've heard, you instigated this, and you're lucky he's not pressing charges against you for assault." The words struck Hank like a blow, and his confidence began to diminish. The other motorcyclists shifted uncomfortably, refraining from making eye contact with anyone in the room. The male officer continued, "This is the course of action. We're filing a report about this incident. If you want to pursue your claims, you're welcome to do so, but you should know that false accusations are a serious matter." Hank attempted to respond, but he quickly closed his mouth after recognizing that he was being pursued. The officers took a step back and conducted a final inspection of the room. The female officer turned to Terence as the tension began to subside. "Thank you for keeping your cool. We'll make sure this is documented correctly." Terence maintained his composure as he gave her a slight inclination. "Thank you, officer." The bikers began to shuffle out of the bar, their previous bravado being displaced by an awkward silence. Hank, who was still incensed, directed one final glance at Terence before exiting through the door. The officers followed shortly thereafter, allowing the bar to gradually revert to its customary level of conversation. Terence resumed his seat, his beverage remaining unfinished. He was relieved that the situation had not escalated further, despite the fact that the weight of the encounter persisted. The other patrons whispered and stole glimpses in his direction, their previous wariness having been replaced by quiet respect. Terence was repairing his antiquated pickup vehicle in the driveway of his modest residence on the outskirts of Fayetteville, North Carolina, a few days later. He tightened a bolt under the hood as the late afternoon sun cast lengthy shadows across the yard. The pub incident's memory persisted not because of the confrontation itself, he had encountered worse in combat, but because of the symbolism it represented. It was not the first instance in which he had been unjustly judged, and he was skeptical that it would be the last. He was distracted from his musings by the sound of tires crunching gravel. He stood up, wiped his hands on a cloth and turned to observe a motorbike entering the driveway. One of the men from the bar, the motorcyclist, was wiry and wore a leather jacket that appeared to be 2 sizes too large. His hair was thinning. Terence identified him as Bill, a member of Hank's staff. Bill deactivated the engine and dismounted, eventually removing his helmet and hesitantly approaching. His demeanor was cautious, bordering on apologetic, as if he were approaching a stray dog that he wished not to arouse. "Is that correct?" Bill inquired, his voice remaining subdued. Terence acknowledged but refrained from speaking, anticipating the outcome of the conversation. Bill cleared his throat and tucked his hands into the pockets of his jacket. I wanted to come by and say I'm sorry for what happened at the bar." Terence's eyebrows were raised in surprise, but he was not wholly persuaded. "You were involved," he stated with aplomb. Bill's face was flushed with remorse as he nodded. "I know. I didn't stop it, and I should have. Hank, he's got a way of riling people up, and I went along with it. But that doesn't make it right. I've been thinking about it ever since, and I just wanted to tell you that." Terence briefly examined Bill. While the man's sincerity was apparent, his distress was also apparent. Terence's tone was composed as he inquired, "Why now?" Bill looked down at his footwear and shrugged. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because, well, seeing you handle yourself the way you did, it made me realize how wrong we were. You didn't deserve any of that." Terence was silent for an extended period of time. Next, he sighed and crossed his arms as he leaned against the vehicle. "What do you want from me, Bill?" "Forgiveness." Bill gazed upward, his eyes reflective of his sincerity. "Maybe. But more than that, I want to be better. I've seen a lot of hate in my life, and I don't want to add to it anymore. What we did was wrong, and I need to own up to it." Terence's demeanor marginally relaxed. He had previously encountered apologies, some of which were sincere and others that were insincere. This one was distinct. Not due to the remarks, but rather due to the effort it required for Bill to attend. Terence finally expressed his gratitude for your attendance. It doesn't erase what happened, but it's a start. Bill's visage washed with relief as he nodded. "Thanks, man. I mean it." Terence observed Bill as he mounted his bicycle and initiated the engine, experiencing an unusual combination of emotions. Bill's contrition was a glimmer of hope, a small but significant stride towards comprehension, despite the fact that the incident at the bar had served as an unflattering reminder of the prejudice he still encountered. Terence returned to his vehicle and once more wiped his hands as he contemplated the events of the previous few days. He was aware that the battle against illiteracy was not yet concluded, but he also recognized that he was not the only one involved. Perspectives could be altered by the decisions he made and the manner in which he conducted himself, one individual at a time. The tranquility of the evening air was interrupted by the distant murmur of cicadas as he completed his task. Terence experienced a sense of determination, not only to continue progressing, but to confront the world with the same fortitude and integrity that had served him throughout his military career. Occasionally, the battles were not conducted abroad. Occasionally, they were waged in the presence of others, in homes, in bars, and in the hearts of individuals. Terence considered those conflicts to be equally significant.